So for today's Dharma discussion, the title is "This is not me, this is not mine, I am not this." And this line comes from the Pali Canon, when the Buddha was teaching about non-self. And I want to talk about that in a maybe in a different way. The Buddha never taught that there is no self. It's very specific that there is non-self, and self is a specific definition. And kind of in a simple way, what the Buddha discovered in his awakening is that this persistent, non-changing, eternal self, that concept, is the source of almost all of our suffering. Because with that comes attachment to that which cannot bring security, safety, joy, freedom. And the way I want to talk about that, and we've talked about this before in our Sangha, in the terms of stories, that we all have a repertoire, a list of stories in which we say, this is me. And we share our stories, and we sometimes rewrite our stories. And for us, our stories are very real. And when something challenges the story of self, whatever that story may be, we fight strong. Or we deny anything that shows us that that story is somehow maybe not as solid as we think it is. We fight against that insight. Okay. So I'm going to share a personal story about the storied self. So as a child, I was raised with a beautiful, tender, kind mother who is also a manic depressive, but mostly unipolar. And if anybody understands unipolar, bipolar, she was unipolar depressive. So it would mean her high would be normal, and her usual low would be really low. And I remember from a very young age, my father didn't know how to deal with it or handle it. He had his own stories, which were problematic. And he turned over the role to me to take care of my beautiful mom. And I embraced it. I wholeheartedly took it. And my mom was raised Catholic. And we were a very Catholic family. We had nuns and priests in the family. In a small farm cathedral, actually parish in Sterling, Colorado, my family's name is all over the little cathedral. Hempel and Foxhoven was the name. So my mom was raised on the stories of the martyrs. And she embraced it wholeheartedly and took the stories from that book and sewed it into her heart. And when I was born, she gave me the gift she was given and sewed the book of martyrs within my heart. And that was me. That was my story. And that was the story that I was taught and the story that I embraced. And I was the martyr for my family. There's this photo of me and my family when I was 9, and the photographer just set us up. You know, it's one of those Sears things when they come to your house and they take this family portrait. It's classic. And they stood me, for whatever reason, the photographer stood me in the back with my arms around the family. That he unconsciously knew the role I had been given in my family. Now, that's not unique. My story is not unique. A lot of us were given that same story, and we embraced it wholeheartedly. And we filtered our reality through that story. and our expectation of ourselves and our expectation of other people through these stories. I remember once writing a poem for a girlfriend about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And in the poem, it says, "And I built a cross and climbed up on it and looked at you with my arms outstretched, saying, 'See how much I love you.'" How many of us have done that for someone we love? But it was the first realization in that poem. I said, these things rarely work. So I climbed down off the cross. And I remember the day, I remember when I was walking, when the story collapsed on itself. I was walking on 2nd South, just walking past the Carl's Jr., you know the Carl's Jr. in 2nd South, you know. For me, it's almost a pilgrimage now, not to eat, but to remember that day that I realized that my story was just a story. That I'm not a martyr, I'm not anything. And to simply let it go. It's just a story. Guy Claxton, he has this quote where he writes, "Consciousness is a mechanism for constructing dubious stories whose purpose is to defend a spurless and inaccurate sense of self." Consciousness is a mechanism for constructing dubious stories whose purpose is to defend a superfluous and inaccurate sense of self. Usually I can say that. I love that word, yeah. I call them antibodies. Okay? What does an antibody do? Comes in, attacks that thing which is threatening the system. Okay? I remember having those when I used to be LDS. I was leaving. I believed it more when I was leaving than I ever did when I was in it. You know? You don't believe in the devil, but he believes in you. That's a good antibody. Oh, that's a good one. That kind of tied me up. Like, well, a digression. Let's shift for a moment and let's talk about fiction and nonfiction. What's the definition of fiction and nonfiction? General definition.
Real and not real.
Real and fake. Okay? So, question is, are our stories fictive by nature, or are they fact?
The facts as we believe them.
Hey, that's fiction. That's still fictive. Okay? I think it's interesting that our own stories for us are so real.
They're always fiction.
They're always fictive.
It's just it's probably how far is it from reality.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
we get to assign our perspective, our
Yes.
view into it. So does everybody else.
Yep. Okay. Good. Thank you. So it's interesting how, and we also tend to place this value on nonfiction over the fictive. Okay? And I think that's a false demarcation. I think in some ways fiction can be more truer than what we would assign as truth.
That's true.
It's something to think about. It's interesting that we make a distinction when we talk about books and not our lives. Our stories is what we create to give meaning to our experience. But the challenge is our stories then give rise to our reality because they're what we filter the world through. Have you ever seen a chart of all the cognitive biases that we as humans have? There's hundreds of cognitive biases. And we think we see the world as it is. But we all see the world through a myriad of biases, which filter our direct experience. So I think it's important for us to examine our stories. And we do this through introspection, through meditation. And here's a great teaching from Haya Akegaresu. And he is in our Bright Dawn lineage. And it's the first stage in introspection where we engage our stories But we're so habituated with them that when we engage them, we need to realize this. From Haya Akegaresu. Whenever we start looking into ourselves, immediately the thought of good and bad crops up into our minds, and we start considering good and bad as applied to our deeds or others' reactions to them. As soon as we think good and bad, we start asking, how can I stop at the good, at the bad, and do the good? And the challenge with this is that it degenerates into a shallow secondary morality. So we start to go in, and we're so attached to our stories that we're automatically judging everything in our introspection. This side of me is good, this side of me is bad. This side of me I can show, this side of me I have to hide. I have to even hide it from myself. Shame. That shame is so strong that we lock it away, whatever that is that we are ashamed of. You lock it under lock and key. We put 20 padlocks on it to make sure nobody knows about that thing we are ashamed of. And the horrible thing is we've locked ourselves inside with it. We think we're safe by locking it up, but we've locked ourselves inside with it. So we want to go in, we want to enter into this awareness of our stories and to be non-judgmental, but to be discerning and to look. Brene Brown, you probably know Brene Brown. She's a professor, and she studies empathy, compassion, and she says the difficult part of our stories is often that is what we bring to them, what we make up about who we are and how we are perceived by others. Yes, maybe we failed or screwed up a project, but what makes the story so painful is what we tell ourselves about our own self-worth and value. So we start to engage our stories, and maybe in our initial engagement with our stories, it's going into a dark cave, and it's frightening. And it may be frightening because that thing that you always thought was your greatest strength is really one of your greatest weaknesses. And it's also liberating to find out what you thought was your greatest weaknesses is one of your liberating strengths. It turns our world upside down when we're willing to engage with our stories. Comparison at many times fuels our stories. And especially the not so good parts of our stories. So how does comparison fuel your story?
Makes you feel less than sometimes.
Makes you feel less than. Do we compare? I mean, come on. All day, every day. All day, every day.
Or like, my hurt's worse than your hurt. You know, my suffering's way worse than your suffering.
And vice versa. My suffering's unworthy because you suffered so much more. How else?
Growing up, so I'm number 4 of 8 kids. I'm dead center. It's great. So there's 10 of us my whole entire life, and that literally is all we did growing up. And is to get the attention of, you know, maybe with my parents or whatever, just interacting with each other. We were always trying to one-up each other. And we still do that even now. And the youngest is, 15. And like getting to the point where it's interesting the dynamic shift of like what really actually matters and what doesn't. Because as a kid, you know, having the bigger, the badder toy was better than having, you know, whatever your sibling had. And now it's kind of just like, we're literally 8 totally different personalities. Why have we been spending our entire life trying to be better than the other person when it's physically impossible? Because no matter how hard I try, I cannot be as tall as my 6'2" brother. I can't. I wish I could, but I'm not. It's just like you said. Why?
I mean, come on. Most of our culture is based on comparison. How can consumer society exist without comparison? I mean, come on. Everything on TV, every commercial you watch, every advertisement is based on comparison. You lack where you are. You need this to be fulfilled. constantly comparing. So an example of my story earlier about my cardiac stuff, my mom, when she was like 58, I think she had a heart attack when she was 58. And I'm thinking, here I am 55, and I could have had a heart attack at 53 if I wouldn't have taken care of it. And I've lived a good life, and I've been, healthy and active. And she didn't do anything, and smoked 5 packs a day, and was way overweight, 8 sticks of butter, and it's not fair. And that's comparison. And what does that have to do with anything? And it drives our stories, and we start comparing others. And how about victim blaming? How we look at somebody who something horrible has happened to them, and we start comparing our lives to them, and we say, well, that wouldn't happen to me because I wouldn't do that. I'm safe because I wouldn't do that. This comparison is a thief of happiness. Teddy Roosevelt actually said that. Comparison is the thief of happiness. So, Haya Akegaresu Sensei goes on and he says, we must go one step beyond this moralistic introspection, good and bad. When you consider good and bad, it means that you're creating some standard from outside of yourself. And pondering how to fit yourself into that, irritating yourself even more so. And he says, this is a useless introspection. A person who wants to thoroughly be himself stops such introspection, such judging of good and bad, and must find out where his true or her true self is, and how much he simply borrowed from others and painted over the outside. So, a few of you probably read the Four Agreements. The Four Agreements is about that, those stories that are not our stories. And we embrace them and make certain decisions and agreements based on those stories. He goes on to say, we have to return whatever we steal and borrow. Whatever we receive, we have to peel it off. Whatever we painted on, we have to make an effort to scrape it off, to touch our true self. He goes on to say, this is what I mean when I say that we should discover who and what we really are. A meditation teacher, I can't remember her name, who we recited here before, tells us that our self, our true self, is underneath all the noise and stories we have about reality and ourselves. And the process of meditation is to get beneath that noise. When we sit in here and we meditate for 10-15 minutes, usually about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, we're starting to really get just a little bit underneath the noise. The daily practice is a way that we come to be friends with ourselves by getting under the noise and the stories. And we start looking at them with courage and objectively. Is this me? Or is this the story my mother gave me? Is this me, or is this the story my society has given me? Is this the story of what it means to be a woman or a man? Or is this the story my culture has told me what that means? Or straight, or gay, or transgender? Let's go back to the teachings of the Buddha. When the Buddha was teaching about anatta, or non-self, he taught that all forms should be seen as they really are with proper wisdom, and thus, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. And I think we can apply this to our stories. If we go back to what Akegaresu said, he says when we feel disconsolate, when we suffer, we really have to look into ourselves and ask, what am I really looking for? When I am interested in something or enjoying something or suffering in something, I need to look into myself and find out what is my true wish and my true longing in this experience. He reiterates that we have to introspect and introspect. And when we clarify what it is in others, what it is and what is our own, then we definitely have to throw away the things we've stolen and honestly go the way of our true inner desire. This is the only opening of the way to entertain awakening. Now, how do we do this? We do this through, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. We do this because our self-definitions are chains and limitations that bind us. Right understanding on the Eightfold Path is the understanding that your body is not yourself. Your emotions are not yourself. Your thoughts are not yourself. And even your awareness is not yourself. So as we take this journey, what can we expect? David Loy, who wrote a great book on the stories we tell, says, what happens when I realize that my story is a story? One meaning of freedom is the opportunity to act out the story I identify with. Another freedom is the ability to change stories and my role within them. I move from scripted character to co-author of my own life. And this reminds me of something Kakuyo Sensei teaches, to be the artist of your own life. That life, existence, is a creative process. David Loy goes on to write, a third type of freedom results from understanding how stories construct and constrict my possibilities. Whether or not karma is an unfathomable moral law built into the cosmos, living a story has consequences. The difference between good and bad karma is the difference between life stories that decrease and increase suffering. The difference is different from the difference between improving one's karma and realizing how karma works, which frees one from karma. The most troublesome narratives attempt to secure and aggrandize the ego self, understood to be separate from the rest of the world. Its supposed interests are pursued at the cost of others. And those efforts boomerang because the discrete self is a delusion. So I want to ask you to take a few minutes to think about it. What story of self that you hold on that is limiting your freedom? What story of myself is limiting my freedom? Some of them are the story of abandonment, the story of unworthiness, the story of limitation, maybe even the story of no limitation. What concept of self are you attached to, that you're bound to? That you can control your world, control others? How is that story manifest in your life? As you go through your week, I want you to remember these three things, these three words, or three phrases, and use them as a mantra, as a way to refocus your attention and intention to what is truly real, and that's the present moment. This is not me. This is not mine. I am not this. So as you're going through your day and emotions come up, the Buddha says you are not your emotions. It doesn't say they're not real, but you are not them. Your thoughts are not you. This body is not you. My sadness, my joy is not me. It's what I experience. So I challenge you to go forth and to be introspective of our stories, to watch them arise and watch them dissipate, to see when they come up strong. I remember the first time I noticed my stories is when I hadn't been with my family for like 3 or 4 years, and I went back and was with them, and I took on the role and the story all of a sudden. It was there, and it was alive, and it was real. And when I left, the story dissipated. So identify that in your own personal life. Even when you're meditating, stories arise. Look at them. As Haya Akegaresu says, where did I steal this story? Where did I borrow this story from? What's painted over? Get rid of all that shit. Eric.
Shouldn't we, let me say, this is a game I play with myself. Let's see how this plays out. What you think of it. We're all going to have stories. So it's which stories do we hold and how tight do we hold on to them? And really, we never saw what really happened, because what really happened, we just don't have enough senses to pick it all up. And even then, we're assigning meaning to it. So if we had like 10 times the information, we still would be building stories. So then it's 3 choices. When you hold the story, what do you do with it? How do you interpret it? Because when you put it away, you're going to put it away different every single time. It will never be the same story. That's what I tell myself, is that we really choose everything about the story. Like its power, how positive, negative, or maybe it's a mix. It's like you just always choose it. The other thing is there's reality that happen that's part of our stories that we really don't want, to even acknowledge, right? We don't want it to be good or bad. We just want it to go away. So I think the power of when we reprocess our stories is try to position the stories that you like, on the shelf in a way that's positive, but not too powerful, because you want to live in the moment. If you make something in the past too powerful, even if it's happy, it's gonna control your day. And then of course the negative things, you just want to make them smaller and smaller, and you're just gonna. But I guess the reality is when we play games on things that we think we're done with that story, when we're not. And so that's the catch to this whole activity. But I think overall, it's almost like a vantage point to reality. You have like a pinpoint, this is reality right here. You'll never see it. But you can choose where you're going to look at it from. if you're happier and you have more energy, you're going to look at a situation and you're going to start to process it, and you'll be around other people too who'll do the same. So that's where I think we start building a more proactive and positive and strong story, because shit's going to come our way. We can't avoid that. So,
I think the point too, and I think it was a really good point. David Lloyd, he goes on in his book, he says that we cannot not story
No.
as human beings. And there is even some within the evolutionary biology community where they're trying to say what separates, us from other beings. And all the ones they've had over the years have all failed. Tool making, recognition of self. But one is this story making that we do. And that's probably even going to be limited on a certain point. But it's the story we choose. And the teachings of the Buddha, that middle way, is that we don't have attachment to our story. It's not that story itself is inherently wrong, but it's that we don't examine the story. We hold the story to be somehow fixed and unchanging. You can think of our existence or our life as like choose your own adventure story. It just goes on and on and on. And we have constant opportunities to go A or B, C or D. And who knows, maybe we'll come back and do them all. But it's still, we have a tendency to live habituated stories, and we never examine the stories. And we're so attached to them, we have no idea what is our story and what is not. And our stories can be so ingrained in who we are that when one aspect of the story changes, we cease to be important or valued or meaningful. And I think as you examine your life, as you do this introspection, you'll see how deep these are and how you can become a co-creator of your story. And you can become an artist of your life, as Kakuyo Sensei teaches us.
Namo Amida Buddhist.
I want to close just with the last words of Haya Akegaresu. He says, when you discover the true self, there is no need to worry about comparison with the standards of others, what they think about you, or whether something is good or bad. It is really the true self, then regardless of what society calls good or bad, and you no longer respond to others' opinions with either gladness or hesitation. You simply go on and break through into your own true nature. This is the only absolute goodness. Therefore, to introspect and to discover yourself is to discover absolute good. It is my wish that we all discover that absolute good within ourselves.
Namo Amida Buddhist.